An excerpt from the poem Alone by Maya Angelou. Lying thinking last night how to find my soul a home where water is not thirsty and bread loaf is not stone. I came up with one thing, and I don't believe I'm wrong, that nobody but nobody can make it out here alone. Now, if you listen closely, I'll tell you what I know. Storm clouds are gathering. The wind is going to blow. The race of man is suffering, and I can hear the moan, 'cause nobody but nobody can make it out here alone. In my wonderful seminary days, I was gifted with a best friend, mentor, and guru by the name of Glenn Wheeler. He showed me how to read the most significant theologians and philosophers of our age. At his encouragement, we worked together at the Children's Psychiatric Unit of the Norton Children's Hospital for 3 years, and my eyes were opened to another portal of existence in the world of mental illness. Glenn and I lived together, played together, studied and traveled together. He was from my hometown of Jacksonville. His grandmother knew my grandmother and was best friends and cooking partner with my mother at the Baptist church where both of us grew up. You could say we shared a deep, long history, a rare soul partnership that extended until his untimely death just before the COVID crisis in 2019. I would be hard-pressed to name another person who, along with my 2 wives and children, and he knew, incidentally, both of my wives, made a larger impression on my life. It was there, often under Glenn's wing, that I began my lifelong journey of discovering the sacredness of everything. Glenn and I would walk the railroad tracks at night, waiting for a train to come along and send us diving for the bushes at the banks on either side. We called it meeting God. I've met God so many places since then. I found God in a heart attack. I heard God in the dark of night with pounding waves and growing wind on a tiny boat at sea. I saw God once in the faint glow of a scuba dial when all of our lights were out, and I was leading a trusted group of friends out of an underwater cave in pitch darkness. I tasted God in my throat on the edge of a mountain cliff that beckoned and tugged like a siren song while I was peering into the abyss. I have lain depressed in the center of a lonely highway at 2 a.m., waiting for God and wondering if I would find the strength to get up before I finally fell asleep and met God face to face. Today, I'm going to tell you about the time I met God on a snowy mountain road going to Gethsemane. Way back in those seminary days, the certainties and securities of my homegrown Baptist faith were beginning to melt away under the bright, hot light of a graduate education in religion. life was changing fast. That great German theologian Paul Tillich, in his book, The Shaking of the Foundations, explored how the modern crises of our lives, and they differ, of course, from age to age, how they reveal the groundlessness of human existence, prompting us to search for deeper meaning beyond the narrow limits of our cultural foundations, to search for something meaningful and true beyond that groundlessness. We were feeling that anxiety as we prepared there for adulthood and work as ministers, leading others toward the spiritual life. For Tillich and his age in the first half of the 20th century, that angst, that groundlessness resided in the rise of Nazi Germany and 2 world wars. For us at our age, it expressed itself in the civil rights fight for justice, in the hollowness of the American dream, in environmental damage, and the threat of an atomic war. It was in this atmosphere that Glenn introduced me to the life of Thomas Merton, that famous Trappist monk who had lived at a nearby monastery in the woods of central Kentucky. That Cistercian monastery, only 60 miles from Louisville and the Baptist Seminary, was called the Abbey of Gethsemane. Merton once wrote that the biblical basis for a monastic life is the call into the wilderness. We find it first in the desert wanderings of the Exodus story as they come out of Egypt and bondage. We find it in John the Baptist in the desert, eating locusts and wild honey, we are told, proclaiming the arrival of Jesus. We find it in the temptation of Christ in the desert. Merton said the contemplative life is not an escape from social responsibility or life's experience. It isn't an escape from, but an advance into solitude and the desert. The one who dares to be alone, he wrote, can come to see that the emptiness and the uselessness which the collective mind fears and condemns are actually necessary conditions for the encounter with truth. Glenn and I ate that up. The movie version of Jesus Christ Superstar had come out just a couple of years before, and we watched it and listened to that soundtrack hundreds of times until we had it memorized by heart. Just as Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days, we took our road trips to Indiana, volunteered at Koinonia Farms, walked the railroad tracks, and visited the Abbey of Gethsemane. Merton had passed away just a few years earlier, but we could sit in the balcony of the little chapel at 4 a.m. and hear the monks perform their Vesper service. We could visit Merton's hermitage in the woods on that property where he would go to be alone when even monastery life was too much for him. One early winter morning, Glenn and I were heading to Gethsemane. I was driving my Pinto station wagon. Glenn was navigating. He was more familiar with the route. He'd been there much more often. It was 2 a.m. and snowing. Around a curve in the woods, a smaller road veered left, and I, confused, turned the wheel suddenly in that direction. We spun around a time or two and slid backward into the ditch, stuck fast in the snowbank. I think I caught a glimpse of God then, briefly. As we pondered what to do in that cold night air, a Jeep surprisingly came along in that wee hour approaching 3 a.m. It was a monk returning to the monastery. Of course he stopped and helped us. What a thrill. He said he hadn't time to help us exorcise the car from the ditch. That would have to come later. We had to get back to Gethsemane for Vesper service. And so he drove us to Gethsemane and promised a return to pull the car out in the later daylight. For two young radicals who dismissed the literal interpretation of the gospel story, the appeal of Gethsemane was its deep devotion. Devotion to silence, devotion to meditation, devotion to purity of heart and thought. Devotion to the life of Jesus, not his divinity, except as that shone a light on our own divinity as sons and daughters of God. The call was not to worship Jesus, but to emulate him. And the appeal of a place like Gethsemane was the central focus of prayer, meditation, and commitment. Creating and living an holistic life, a true life, without compromise or distraction. A life where our vocation and our calling to love are completely integrated. That was our desire. Robert A. Johnson wrote a book called We, Understanding the Psychology of Romantic Love. In it, he shares this story. Many years ago, a wise friend gave me a name for human love. She called it stirring the oatmeal love. This phrase represents the difference between human love and romance. I would call it, myself personally, stirring the grits, but I'm a Southerner. Stirring the oatmeal, he says in the story, is an humble act, not exciting or thrilling, but it symbolizes a relationship that brings love down to earth. It represents a willingness to share ordinary human life, to find meaning in the simple, unromantic tasks, earning a living, budgeting, putting out the garbage, feeding the baby in the middle of the night. To stir the oatmeal means to find the value, even the beauty, in simple and ordinary things, like the rice hulling of the Zen monks, the spinning wheel of Gandhi, the tent making of St. Paul. It represents the discovery of the sacred in the midst of the humble and ordinary. You hold the key to love and fear, all in your trembling hand. Just one key unlocks them both. It's there at your command. So may we find our sacred love.